October 25, 1944. Dawn breaks over the Philippine Sea near Samar Island. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita stands on the bridge of the battleship Yamato, scanning the horizon through salt-crusted binoculars. His center force, 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, 11 destroyers, has just navigated the treacherous San Bernardino Strait under cover of darkness. Ahead lies what he believes to be the soft underbelly of the American invasion fleet, vulnerable troop transports and supply ships protected by perhaps a handful of destroyers. Then the lookouts report aircraft carriers on the horizon. Kurita's staff officers exchange glances of grim satisfaction. Finally, a chance to engage the American fleet carriers that have haunted the Imperial Navy since Midway. The range closes. 4 carriers become visible, then 5, then 6. But something is wrong. These carriers are too small, their flight decks too short. They move with a desperate speed that fleet carriers do not possess. One of Kurita's officers lowers his binoculars and speaks the words that capture the moment's terrible revelation. These are not the giants. These are the children, and there are hundreds of them. The Imperial Japanese Navy had built its entire strategic doctrine around a single assumption, that aircraft carriers were rare and precious assets, capital ships whose construction required years of specialized industrial effort and whose loss could reshape the balance of naval power. This belief was not irrational. Japan's own carrier program had taken decades to develop, each fleet carrier representing an enormous investment in engineering, resources, and trained personnel. When the war began in December 1941, Japan possessed 10 fleet carriers, an advantage they believed decisive. The American Navy countered with 7. By Japanese calculations, carrier warfare would be a war of attrition measured in individual hulls, where each sinking resonated strategically for months or years. They had watched USS Lexington go down at Coral Sea, Yorktown at Midway, Hornet at Santa Cruz, and they had counted these as victories that could not be easily replaced. Their own losses, Akagi, Kaga, Soryo, Hiryo at Midway, had been catastrophic precisely because carriers could not be conjured from thin air. Or so they believed.
What Japanese naval intelligence failed to comprehend was that America had changed the fundamental equation of carrier construction. In 1941, the United States Maritime Commission and the Navy's Bureau of Ships initiated a program that treated aircraft carriers not as bespoke capital ships, but as mass-produced industrial products. The Escort carrier, designated CVE, cynically nicknamed Combustible, Vulnerable, Expendable by their own crews, was designed to be built quickly and in vast numbers. Converted from merchant ship hulls or purpose-built in standardized sections, these vessels sacrificed speed and armor for rapid production. The Kaiser shipyards in Vancouver, Washington, developed an assembly line process that could deliver a complete escort carrier in an average of 3 months. 3 months from keel laying to commissioning, a timeline that would have seemed fantastical to Japanese admirals who understood carrier construction as a multi-year endeavor requiring specialized facilities. The first escort carriers joined the fleet in 1941, modest vessels intended primarily for anti-submarine patrols and convoy protection. By 1942, production accelerated. By 1943, American shipyards were launching escort carriers faster than Japan could train pilots for its remaining fleet carriers. The numbers became obscene by conventional naval standards. 77 escort carriers commissioned during the war, with 18 different classes representing iterative improvements in design. At peak production, American yards were completing 1 escort carrier every week. Japanese naval planners receiving intelligence reports of this production surge initially dismissed the figures as propaganda or counting errors. No industrial system, they reasoned, could produce aircraft carriers, even small ones, with the casual abundance of automobiles. They were thinking in terms of their own industrial capacity, their own resource constraints, their own understanding of what was possible. They could not imagine an economy so vast that it treated warship construction as a scaling problem rather than a craftsmanship challenge. The strategic impact manifested across every theater of the Pacific War. In the Atlantic, escort carriers closed the mid-ocean air gap that U-boats had exploited, turning the Battle of the Atlantic decisively against Germany by mid-1943. In the Pacific, they provided air cover for amphibious invasions, allowed fleet carriers to focus on striking enemy bases rather than defending landing forces, and created a layered defense that made Japanese submarine intersection nearly impossible. But the psychological impact, the moment when Japanese officers confronted the reality of American industrial capacity, came off Samar, when Kurita's battleships, the most powerful surface force Japan could still deploy, found themselves facing not the main carrier fleet, but a token force of 6 escort carriers that the Americans considered so expendable they had designated them Taffy 3, a nickname more suited to a children's game than a naval unit. Those 6 carriers, Fanshawe Bay, St. Lo, White Plains, Culloden Bay, Kitkun Bay, and Gambier Bay, should have been annihilated within 30 minutes. They possessed no armor capable of withstanding battleship shells, no speed to outrun cruisers, no defensive armament beyond a few 5-inch guns. But they possessed aircraft, and they possessed a doctrine born from the understanding that they were replaceable. The CVE pilots flew attack runs with depth charges and practice bombs when their anti-ship ordnance was exhausted, making dummy runs to draw anti-aircraft fire when they ran out of ammunition entirely. They flew because there would be another carrier, another air group, another wave behind them. The Japanese had no equivalent paradigm. Their carriers were irreplaceable, their pilots precious, trained over years in a program that could not scale. When a Japanese carrier sank, it took with it not just hull and aircraft, but institutional knowledge, veteran crews, and tactical capability that required years to rebuild.
The escort carrier became more than a weapon. It became a symbol of an unbridgeable gap in philosophy. Japanese shipyards, by 1944, were cannibalizing damaged vessels for parts, converting battleships into hybrid carriers because they lacked the resources to build purpose-designed hulls. American yards were building carriers for next year's campaigns, for operations planned but not yet approved, for contingencies that might never occur. Japanese pilots, encountering American carrier aircraft, could not determine from the engagement whether they had faced a fleet carrier or an escort carrier. The aircraft were often identical, the tactics indistinguishable. The realization spread through the ranks. It no longer mattered which American ships you sank, because there were always more. Always. After Samar, after watching his battleships spend hours trying to destroy a force of escort carriers that should have been swept aside in minutes, after seeing Gambier Bay sink but the others escape, Kurita withdrew. His official report cited concerns about American reinforcements, but captured diaries and post-war interviews reveal a deeper truth. One officer wrote, "We did not know we were fighting a country that could build carriers faster than we could train men to sink them. This changes everything. This changes what victory could possibly mean." The mathematics of attrition had inverted. Japan had entered the war believing that trading one carrier for one carrier favored them. They had shorter supply lines, defensive advantages, interior positions. But when the exchange rate became one Japanese carrier for 10 American escort carriers, and America could replace its losses in a quarter, attrition became a weapon of American victory rather than Japanese defense. By war's end, the United States Navy operated more aircraft carriers, fleet and escort, combined than the rest of the world's navies combined throughout all of history to that point. 77 escort carriers alone, each one representing 3 months of industrial effort and a supply chain that stretched from steel mills in Pennsylvania to aircraft factories in California to training bases across the continental United States. Japan built 18 carriers total across its entire naval history. The comparison was not merely numerical. It represented 2 incompatible understandings of what modern war demanded. Japan built weapons. America built capacity to build weapons, an infinite regression of industrial depth that treated the warship as an output of a system rather than a singular achievement.
In 1946, a former Japanese naval officer named Tamaichi Hara, interviewed by American occupation authorities, was asked what single factor most influenced Japan's defeat. He did not cite the atomic bombs or island-hopping campaigns or submarine warfare. He said, the escort carriers. Not because they were effective weapons, though they were, but because they proved you could build them at all. When we saw how many you had, we understood that we were not fighting a country. We were fighting a continent pretending to be a nation. An industrial force that could absorb our best efforts and return them multiplied 100-fold. You did not defeat us with better ships. You defeated us with the idea that ships could be mass-produced like rice bowls, that complexity could be standardized, that abundance itself was a strategy. We had no counter to abundance. Our culture, our training, our entire way of war was built on scarcity, on doing more with less, on the elegance of efficiency. You countered with inelegant plenty, and plenty won. The escort carriers, those combustible and vulnerable vessels their own crews mocked, proved more durable than the empire that faced them. They were not beautiful ships. They were not the subjects of propaganda posters or naval paintings. They were industrial products stamped out with the same unsentimental efficiency as trucks or cargo ships. But in their very ordinariness lay their power. The power of a democracy that could mobilize resources not through command, but through coordination. That could turn the productive capacity of an entire continent toward a single purpose. That believed so thoroughly in its cause that it built not for today's battle, but for battles that might never come. The flight decks that confused Kuita that morning off Samar were not just steel and timber. They were proof that freedom, when married to industry, could outproduce tyranny by orders of magnitude. The carriers multiplied because the system that created them was itself generative, expansive, fundamentally inexhaustible. And against inexhaustible abundance, even the finest warships, crewed by the bravest men executing the most elegant tactics, could only delay the inevitable. The horizon that morning was not filled with carriers. It was filled with the future, arriving faster than anyone had thought possible.